Morning began, as always, with the aroma of coffee. The silence of the apartment, broken only by the faint hum of the coffee machine, felt oddly soothing. I laid out the breakfast table, carefully maintaining the facade of perfection. James came downstairs at exactly 7, his footsteps as precise as the rest of his life. He sat across from me, barely glancing up from his phone. "The coffee's great as usual," he muttered without looking away from his messages. I nodded. Outwardly, everything seemed normal, but inside something was breaking. It felt as if an invisible wall stood between us. James had always been a man of order, of stability, and once that had been reassuring. His confidence, his ability to solve problems, his calm and steady gaze, all of it had drawn me in. But now that same order felt cold and suffocating. His morning routine followed its usual script: tailored suit, a perfectly knotted tie, endless checks of his calendar. He left for work with a polished smile, as rehearsed as everything else in his life. I stayed behind in the apartment that felt like a museum. Every object in its place, nothing out of order, every detail meticulously planned. My thoughts drifted back to the previous evening. The family dinner had been typical, except for one moment. Victor, James's younger brother, had arrived unexpectedly. His presence had lightened the atmosphere, his laughter and animated stories drawing attention. James had maintained his usual composure, but I noticed how he occasionally glanced at Victor. Then there was that look. Victor's gaze had lingered on me a moment too long. It was direct, almost bold. It felt as though he could see through me, noticing what James never did. It made me uncomfortable. I looked away, but the feeling of his attention stayed with me. A phone call broke my thoughts. James. He called to say he'd be late because of a meeting. His tone was steady, professional, as always. I gave a short reply and hung up. Minutes later, my phone buzzed again. A message. From Victor. "You're nothing like the others." My heart raced. Those words struck me, pulling me out of my routine. I sat on the edge of the couch, gripping the phone tightly, unsure how to respond. The gym had always been my escape, a place where I could clear my head from intrusive thoughts. Grueling workouts, the rhythmic pounding of feet on the treadmill, the metallic clang of weights, all of it helped me stay grounded. But today, even the gym couldn't free me from the restlessness that clung to me. Victor's message, his strange yet magnetic words, kept playing in my mind. I tried to block him out, focusing on my breathing and movement, but as I moved to the weight machines, his voice startled me from behind. "Do you always work this hard on yourself?" I turned around. Victor stood there, dressed in workout gear, looking as if he'd stumbled upon the gym by pure chance. But his faint smile suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. "Victor?" My surprise was evident. "Lori, what are the odds? Coincidences are fascinating, aren't they?" He stepped closer, studying me as though seeing me for the first time. I felt my cheeks heat up, though I tried to stay composed. Victor glanced at the machine I was using and offered to help. "Let me show you a better way to do it." His hands brushed mine as he guided my movement. I felt a subtle jolt, like a current running across my skin. It was so unexpected that I froze for a moment. "Just like that," he said, stepping back. "It's all about the small adjustments." We exchanged a few neutral comments, but there was something deeper in his tone, as though he wasn't just talking about the exercise. I tried to maintain my composure, but every word he said felt like a challenge. "Maybe you should make this a regular habit." His words carried a hint of suggestion, and I realized he wasn't referring to the gym. I nodded curtly, unsure of how to respond. Before leaving, he gave me the same intense look he'd had at dinner. "I hope we'll see each other again, Lori," he said before walking away, leaving me alone with my conflicted thoughts. I stood frozen, realizing how that brief encounter had shaken something within me. Was it just an innocent coincidence? Or was I willingly opening the door to something I shouldn't? I hesitated for a long time. Victor had texted me suggesting we meet at a cafe. "It's nothing serious, just a chat," I told myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Everything inside me screamed that this was a mistake. Yet something inexplicable made me agree. The cafe was small, cozy, with dim lighting and the scent of fresh pastries. Victor was already seated by the window, his eyes lighting up the moment he saw me. My heart quickened. "Lori, I'm glad you came." His voice was warm, almost genuine. I sat across from him, nervously tucking my hair behind my ear. The conversation began with small talk, the weather, work, trivial things, but it slowly shifted to something more personal. "You've always been special," he said suddenly, breaking the pause. I looked up. There was genuine sadness in his voice. "You probably think I'm exaggerating, but you have no idea what it's like to live in James's shadow. He's always been the better one. Smarter, more successful, more confident. I've never felt like I could measure up." His words touched me. I knew James as a man of order and discipline, but I'd never considered how that might have affected his younger brother. "Victor," I began, but he interrupted me. "You're different. You've always seemed so alive, so real. With you, I feel like I can just be myself." Those words disarmed me. The cafe suddenly felt too warm, the air thick. I couldn't find anything to say, simply staring at him as something inside me began to shift. Victor leaned in closer. His gaze was deep, almost piercing. Before I could say or do anything, his lips brushed against mine. It was a soft but confident kiss. For a moment, I gave in, feeling the warmth of his lips, but then I pulled away. "No, this is wrong," I whispered, standing up. Without looking at him, I rushed out of the cafe. The cold evening air hit my face, but it couldn't cool the storm of emotions inside. My heart was racing, my thoughts were a blur. What had I just done? I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me had become unstable, like water disturbed by a stone. Victor's kiss kept resurfacing in my mind, as if it had etched itself permanently into my consciousness. I tried to distract myself, busying my hands with watering plants or sorting books, but my thoughts always circled back to that evening. When my phone buzzed, I tensed instinctively. A message from Victor. "I'm sorry about yesterday, it was impulsive, but I can't forget you." The words burned. I read them over and over as if searching for some hidden meaning. What did he want? Why would he say that? James came home at his usual time. The sound of his steps in the hallway and the jingle of his keys hitting the glass table in the entryway felt too loud in the heavy silence of the apartment. I set the phone down quickly, trying to appear preoccupied. "How was your day?" he asked, poking his head into the living room. "Fine," I said curtly, keeping my eyes fixed on a book I wasn't really reading. He walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and stood quietly for a moment before speaking again. "You seem tired. Maybe we should spend the evening together. Just talk, watch a movie?" His voice was warm, almost caring, but it grated against my nerves. His attention, once a comfort, now only intensified my guilt. "No thanks," I snapped too sharply. "I just need some time alone." James looked as though he wanted to say something but thought better of it. He turned and left, his footsteps fading into the hum of the apartment, leaving me alone. Sitting on the bed, I opened Victor's message again. His words, so simple and sincere, filled me with conflicting emotions. I knew I should ignore him, but each word seemed to pierce deeper, like a needle. "I can't forget you." I stared at the phone screen, as if searching for answers within myself. Suddenly, shame flooded over me. Shame for myself, for James, who suspected nothing, and for the moment when I allowed myself to falter. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to type a response. Instead, I set the phone down on the nightstand and sat in the dark, feeling the weight of guilt pressing down on me like a suffocating shadow. The workday unfolded as usual. I tried to focus on tasks, but my thoughts kept pulling me elsewhere. Conversations with colleagues sounded empty. Actions felt mechanical. A voice inside me alternated between urging me to stop and pushing me further. Victor appeared suddenly. His silhouette filled the doorway of my office. His suit was immaculate, his gaze steady. But there was something new, an almost blinding calm that concealed his determination. "This won't take long." His voice carried a quiet insistence as he stepped closer than I was comfortable with. He wanted me to take a walk with him. Under any other circumstances, I would have refused, but something in his tone, in his manner, compelled me to stand. We walked along the riverfront. The cool breeze carried the scent of water and the city's noise felt distant. I kept my hands in my coat pockets, avoiding his eyes. Victor spoke. His voice was steady, but each word seared into me. He said he'd been thinking about me since that family dinner. His words felt wrong, yet they stirred something deep within me that I was fighting to suppress. I stepped away slightly, trying to break the dangerous closeness, but he stopped me immediately. His hand touched mine, warm and confident, and suddenly we were too close. I wanted to say it was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. His lips were near, and the next moment I felt them on mine. The kiss was firm yet gentle. For a brief moment I gave in, forgetting everything except this instant. When I finally pulled back, he suggested finding a nearby hotel just to be alone. My mind raced with reasons why it shouldn't happen, but my feet followed him anyway. The room was simple, without unnecessary luxury. As the door clicked shut behind us, I realized how far we'd gone. Victor stepped closer, slipping my coat off my shoulders, his touch so soft that a shiver ran through me. His hands found me as if they already knew every line, every contour. Everything happened so quickly that resistance was futile. His lips explored my shoulders, his hands glided along my back, and each moment felt like teetering on the edge of madness. We weren't searching for anything right or logical. We were simply giving in to the moment. In the silence, broken only by our breaths, there were no excuses, no regrets, only the inevitability of what had already happened. The past few days, I felt like I was living on autopilot. Everything around me seemed meaningless. Conversations with colleagues, routine household tasks, even the usual rituals with James. I could feel his gaze, sharp, attentive, penetrating deeper than usual. He said nothing, but the tension between us grew with each passing day. I caught myself constantly glancing at my phone, waiting for a message from Victor. Each time the screen lit up, my heart raced, only to be followed by an almost unbearable sense of guilt. One evening, when I returned home, a small box was waiting for me in the entryway. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet. On the inner side was an engraving, strong and free. Victor, I had no doubt. Those words seemed to tell me what I was afraid to admit. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, but as I looked at it in the mirror, anxiety rose in my throat. James might notice. I quickly removed it and tucked it into my bag, hoping to forget about the gift. Fate, however, had other plans. While tidying up in the hallway, James stumbled upon the box. "What's this?" His voice was calm, but I knew that tone carried 100 questions. I turned to see the bracelet in his hands. "It's a gift. From a friend," I said, trying to sound as natural as possible, but my unease betrayed me. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me a moment too long. In that instant, I knew he didn't believe me. At dinner, James was unusually quiet. He methodically arranged the cutlery, poured wine, but beneath his composed demeanor, tension hung thick in the air. "Lori, I've been thinking," he finally said, setting his glass down. "Maybe we should go away. Just take a vacation for a couple of weeks. You seem tired, it might do us some good." His suggestion caught me off guard. A vacation? Now? I immediately thought of Victor. We'd planned to meet in a few days. I wanted to spend more time with him, to feel free from all this control. I'm not sure," I began. But James interrupted. "Just think about it. I want us to spend time together." His words sounded sincere, and I knew refusing would only deepen his suspicions. "All right, I think it could be good," I replied, though everything inside me protested. This trip might help me and James, but deep down I already knew. I couldn't simply leave behind what had begun. Before leaving, I knew I had to see Victor. The thought, dangerous as it was, pulled at me stronger than guilt or reason. We met in a secluded spot, far from prying eyes. His gaze, warm and assured, seemed to say this was our last chance before the separation. He wasted no time on words. As soon as we were alone, his hand slid around my waist, and his lips claimed mine in a forceful kiss. Everything inside me screamed about how wrong this was, but it didn't stop me. Each touch from Victor erased the boundaries between logic and passion. After that heated moment, he pulled back, leaving a lingering warmth on my lips. "We'll stay in touch," he said quietly. "Call, text, just make sure he doesn't notice." I nodded, looking at his face full of determination. The moment was so charged with emotion that I didn't know how to say goodbye. The trip with James started perfectly. The first few days of the vacation reminded me of the times when our marriage was full of romance and warmth. He was attentive, gentle, and tried to make every day special. I laughed, caught his loving glances, and for a moment it felt like things could be restored. But Victor lingered in my thoughts. Every morning I secretly checked my phone, reading his messages. "I miss your lips. They're so sweet, so luscious, I feel like I'm losing my mind." One of them made me blush. I tried to be careful, replying only when James wasn't around. But one morning at breakfast, he noticed me quickly putting my phone away as the screen lit up. "Lori, we're on vacation," he said, setting down his cup. "Maybe you could put those little distractions aside for a couple of days?" His voice was calm, but there was a hint of irritation. I smiled, trying to smooth things over. "Of course, you're right. It's just work." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me longer than usual. At that moment, I realized I needed to be even more cautious. Our vacation seemed to be going perfectly, but I could already feel the thin thread of deception stretching tighter and tighter. I tried to convince myself that everything was under control. Victor was far away, yet his presence lingered constantly. His words, his touch, the memories, all of it came back in waves, pulling me further into what I thought I could leave behind. Every day I felt James watching me more closely. His questions became indirect but sharper, his eyes studying me for answers I wasn't ready to give. My phone, once a simple tool, had become a liability. Even a harmless message or call felt like a threat. Victor kept texting. His messages grew more explicit with time. One of them stopped me in my tracks. "I can't wait anymore. I need you. If not in person, then like this. We'll find a way to satisfy this hunger." I knew what he meant. It was madness, and I understood this step would take me further down the path I couldn't retreat from. Yet something inside me refused to say no. James was preparing for a work party. Relief washed over me, knowing I'd have the evening to myself. I claimed I wasn't feeling well. My words sounded convincing enough. He studied me briefly as though considering asking more, but he said nothing and left. When the house was quiet, I picked up my phone. Victor was waiting for my response. I could feel it. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, trying to summon the strength to stop myself. But my heart raced faster. My reply was brief. One word. "Yes." Victor appeared on the screen almost instantly. His gaze, warm and full of desire, felt too close, even through the camera. He spoke little. His voice was low and calm, as if he understood that words weren't necessary anymore. I watched him, as though this was our only way to touch. Moments blurred together and reality faded away. Each gesture he made on the screen awakened what I'd tried to suppress but couldn't. That night marked a new line I'd crossed. Turning back no longer seemed possible. James returned late, long after I had gone to bed. Or at least he thought I was asleep. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, soft and deliberate. His breathing in the room was barely audible, but I could feel his presence lingering longer than usual. I stayed still, eyes shut, hoping the tension would dissipate on its own. But it didn't. James hadn't just come home. He was checking on me. I felt him move closer to my nightstand, heard the faint sound of my phone as he picked it up. My heart froze, though I didn't stir. I hadn't realized how deep his suspicions had grown. I had seen it in his glances, in the brief pauses, in the way his questions hung in the air. But I never thought he'd take it this far, checking my phone while I slept. That wasn't curiosity. That was a search for proof. And he found it. A 2-hour video call. Victor. It was undeniable evidence, not just a suspicion but a fact. The next morning he seemed calm. But I had no idea what storm was raging inside him. We spent the day together as if everything was fine. James was polite, attentive, even affectionate. We walked along the waterfront, had dinner at a small cafe. He smiled, told stories, perhaps trying to recapture a sense of normalcy. I didn't realize he was mentally crafting a plan all along. This wasn't a decision about forgiveness or forgetting. He was figuring out how far I had gone, what else I was hiding. "We're heading home tomorrow," he said that evening as we prepared for bed. "So soon?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "Work can't wait," he replied curtly. I nodded, not daring to argue, but now, looking back, I realize it wasn't a spontaneous decision. James had made up his mind long before I noticed. When we returned home, his detachment was unmistakable. He spoke little, avoided meeting my eyes. I felt the coldness slowly, steadily filling the space between us. I had no idea that he had already decided to bring our story to its end. I stood in front of the mirror again, choosing a dress I knew I shouldn't wear. It was tight-fitting, highlighting the toned figure I'd worked so hard to maintain. It felt inappropriate for a simple talk, but deep down, I knew why I chose it. Victor had texted, asking to meet, and I couldn't refuse. Every time I tried to end this, emotions, attachment, and desire pulled me back in. I sent a short reply. "I'll be there in an hour." What I didn't know was that James had seen the message. He said nothing, but his behavior over breakfast was strange. He stared at me for longer than usual, as if trying to read my thoughts. I dismissed it as fatigue or stress, not realizing he was deciding to follow me. The meeting with Victor was planned at a cafe, but he suggested we move to his home. "No one will disturb us there," he said. I agreed, though my heart pounded louder than usual. James followed us, keeping a safe distance. He watched as I stepped out of the car, as Victor opened the door for me. He couldn't believe this was happening. His wife and his brother? I had no idea he was there. Inside Victor's house, a strange mix of fear and freedom washed over me. We didn't start talking right away. Victor pulled me close and I gave in. His hands, his lips, his presence stripped away any will to resist. James waited outside, consumed by doubt. He wanted to be wrong, to hope that things weren't as they seemed. But as time passed and we didn't come out, it became the final straw. He stormed into the house, no longer hiding. His footsteps echoed in the room, and in that moment, as I sat on the couch in Victor's arms, the world collapsed. James stood in the doorway, his face frozen in a mix of fury and pain. My eyes met his, and I realized there were no excuses left, no chances to hide the truth. That evening felt different. The tension that had followed me for days had become unbearable. I knew meeting Victor wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate step into the unknown. I kept telling myself this would be the last time, the last night to untangle the knot of emotions and passion that had consumed me. Victor greeted me at his door. His gaze was warm, but I saw something akin to unease in his eyes. He understood how far we had gone, but didn't try to stop what was happening. The room was quiet, with only soft lighting creating an illusion of comfort. I sat on the couch, feeling the tension slowly dissipate, replaced by something deeper, a mix of longing and sadness. Victor sat beside me, his hand finding mine, and I couldn't look away. This moment was too real, too powerful to pretend. He touched my face, his lips finding mine, and I surrendered to the kiss. The passion I had tried to suppress overwhelmed me completely. We seemed to forget everything. What was right, what was wrong, the consequences. Only this moment, this single evening, mattered. Then a knock on the door shattered the fragile equilibrium. Sharp and loud, it broke through the silence like a thunderclap. I flinched, my heart stopping for a moment while Victor looked at me questioningly. Before I could say anything, the door opened and James stepped inside. His face didn't show rage, but his cold, piercing gaze said more than any words ever could. He looked at us, his eyes lingering longer than I could bear, then turned and left without a word, leaving the door ajar. His footsteps echoed in the silence while I sat frozen, unable to speak. That moment changed everything. There was no room for lies, no way to go back. I looked at Victor, but deep down, I knew it was over. The house was engulfed in silence, pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. I sat on the couch, unable to move, listening to the sound of a suitcase being zipped shut in the bedroom. Every noise was too loud, too sharp, as if announcing the inevitable. James emerged from the room with a determination I had seen only once, on our wedding day when he vowed to always be with me. But today, his eyes held no love, only a cold emptiness. He stopped at the doorway, turned to look at me, and said, "I can't be with you anymore." I couldn't respond. My mind knew he was right, but my heart broke, clinging to a hollow hope. His voice was even, almost indifferent, and that made the pain sharper. He left, The sound of the door closing echoed through my chest. I was left alone in an empty space where life had once existed. Our photographs still hung on the walls, smiles, embraces, moments that had seemed happy. Now they felt foreign, reminders of what I had destroyed. Hours later, I messaged Victor. His reply came quickly, but it offered no comfort. "I'm leaving, everything is ruined. Our relationship has destroyed too much, I'm sorry." Those words shattered the last remnants of what had held me together. Victor had been my escape, my freedom, but now he was gone too. I tried calling James, but his phone went unanswered. With every silent ring, it became clearer that there was no way back. By evening, I was alone. I wandered through the apartment, looking at the things we had once chosen together. Everything felt lifeless. The place that had been our home was now empty, just like me. I stopped by the window. The city outside was alive, full of movement and light. It seemed oblivious to my collapse. In that contrast, I realized everything I had cared for was gone. James, Victor, my home. Everything I had loved, I had destroyed with my own hands. Sitting on the windowsill, I stared out, feeling the walls around me grow taller. My life was in ruins, and I had no idea how to rebuild it. The days stretched on, slow and viscous, trapping me in their endless monotony. I tried to start a new life, to find some kind of balance, but the past held on to me tighter than I could have imagined. Every object in the apartment reminded me of James. His favorite mug, the books on the shelf, the traces of his habits that had once been part of my world. I tried to act normal. I cleaned, cooked, went to work, even attempted to talk to my colleagues. But it all felt mechanical, devoid of meaning or emotion. Inside, I was empty. One weekend, I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would help clear my mind. The city buzzed with life. People laughed around me, couples held hands. It all seemed alien, out of reach. And then I saw James. He was sitting on the terrace of a cafe talking to a woman. She smiled, leaning slightly toward him, and he looked relaxed, even happy. He was a different person, someone I no longer knew. I froze, hiding behind a store window so he wouldn't see me. My heart clenched, and the pain returned with renewed force. He was moving on, while I remained stuck in the past. Victor kept writing to me. His messages came every week, short, sometimes apologetic, sometimes questioning. But I didn't respond. I couldn't. Everything that had happened between us now felt wrong, destructive. I knew that any reply would drag me back into that vortex. When I returned home, I stopped in front of the mirror. My reflection stared back at me with cold indifference. I saw a woman who had lost everything: her husband, her love, herself. My fingers touched the frame of the mirror as if trying to reach the person I used to be, but she was gone. All that remained was emptiness. The city was no longer my home. Its streets, its sounds, even its air felt heavy, oppressive, like a burden I could no longer carry. Leaving was terrifying, but staying had become impossible. Every corner, every alley held memories, fragments of a life that no longer existed. The decision to leave hadn't come suddenly. It grew slowly, like a cold wind seeping through the cracks in a wall. One morning, waking up in an empty apartment surrounded by silence, I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. I packed a few essentials, some books, documents, a few photographs I couldn't bring myself to throw away. The rest remained in the empty rooms, remnants of a life I was leaving behind. The train station was noisy and chaotic. People hurried, dragging suitcases, embracing each other in farewells. I stood with a small bag in hand, feeling out of place among this vibrant life. No one knew I was leaving. No one was waiting for me at my destination. The train slowly began to move, and my heart started to race. I watched through the window as the city receded. Buildings shrank and disappeared over the horizon. This wasn't just a move, it was an escape. I didn't know where this journey would lead me, but I was certain of one thing: there was no going back. My thoughts swirled like leaves in the wind. I tried to remember who I was before all of this. Before James, before Victor, before the destructive passions and choices that had upended my life. But that past felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. My phone vibrated in my hand. I looked at the screen. Victor. His name still stirred painful emotions: guilt, anger, longing. The message was brief. I still think about you. I stared at the words, feeling two voices battling within me. One wanted to respond, to cling to the familiar, to return to something even if it caused pain. The other voice told me it was time to end this for good. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and, summoning all my strength, pressed delete. Deleting the message felt symbolic. It was a step toward finally letting go of the past. A farewell to what had tethered me, held me in a world that no longer existed. The train picked up speed, carrying me farther away. The scenery outside the window shifted. City blocks gave way to fields. Rivers shimmered in the dim sunlight. I watched it all, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. Images from my past life surfaced in my mind. Moments of happiness with James, our first meeting, his gaze on our wedding day. Then came memories of Victor, his hands, his words, the sense of freedom he gave me. But those memories no longer brought joy, only bitterness. I raised my hand, touched the glass, as if saying goodbye to the person I used to be. This was the final step toward starting something new. But what that life would be, I didn't know. The world outside the window kept changing, but I felt a process of liberation beginning within me. The past would stay behind, along with the emptiness that had haunted me for so long. I didn't know how long healing would take, but for the first time in a long while I felt it was possible. Time passed, but the past refused to let go. I learned about James only indirectly, catching snippets of news from mutual acquaintances. He didn't seem happy, even months after our separation. I heard his career continued to thrive, but in his personal life he avoided new connections. He remained reserved, steering clear of conversations about us and what had happened. The bond between him and Victor, as expected, was destroyed. They no longer spoke. James couldn't forgive the betrayal, and Victor didn't try to justify himself. The rift was final, and that made it even more bitter. Our fleeting attraction, that searing burst of passion, had not only ended my marriage, but also torn apart the relationship between two brothers who had shared their lives since childhood. I often wondered what all of it had brought me. Were those moments with Victor worth everything they had destroyed? Each time I thought of his touch, his words, I couldn't give myself a clear answer. It was fleeting pleasure, a false sense of freedom and escape from routine, but it wasn't worth the ruined lives. Sometimes I questioned why it had happened. Why had I allowed myself to go down that path? And only after some time did I realize this wasn't about Victor or James. It was about me, about my battle with myself, about finding out who I really was. The pain I had caused others was an unavoidable side effect of my chaotic journey. I hadn't sought their suffering, but in my attempt to escape my cage, I destroyed everything around me. Now, I had no choice but to live with the consequences. One day, walking through my new city, I saw a couple. They were sitting on a bench, her head resting on his shoulder, his hands gently holding hers. Their harmony was so natural that I stopped to watch them. In that moment, I realized what I had truly been missing. Not passion, not adrenaline, but calm, genuine love. But that love was no longer in my life. I had destroyed it myself. All I could do now was move forward, accepting that the path I had chosen was a lesson. Foolish, painful, destructive, but perhaps necessary. For what purpose I still didn't know.